Hello, welcome to Weir Tales, a look at stories from the past of Sunderland and Wearside as told in the pages of the Sunderland Echo. Brushes with fame. Browse through the pages of local newspapers from decades gone by and you'll find people's biggest and brightest moments immortalised, along inevitably with some of the saddest. Back in 1969, everyone was going mad for the moon. In July of that year, man set foot there for the first time with the Apollo 11 mission. 2 months before that, in May, there was a dress rehearsal mission. Apollo 10 was a test run of everything that would happen during Apollo 11's mission, bar the lunar landing itself. What does all this have to do with the Marrianne area of Sunderland, I don't hear you ask? Well, a Sunderland couple, Mr. and Mrs. Dennis Jennings of Wickham Way, were keeping their fingers crossed ahead of the takeoff from Cape Kennedy, as the 3 astronauts involved were friends of the family. We've all heard of Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin and, the other one. Well, that's not who we're talking about here. The astronauts on Apollo 10 were Thomas Stafford, John Young and Eugene Cernan. Not names that ring a bell to you, I'm sure. But let's show some respect. How many times have you or I been to space? Ahead of the takeoff, the Jenningses of Marrianne were sent some special keepsakes direct from Houston, Texas. They were sent from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Center by Mr. Jennings's brother-in-law, Mr. George Alexander, a senior engineer engaged on the construction of the engines for the spacecraft. Well, what was the connection to Wearside? Well, Mr. Alexander was married to Dennis Jennings's sister, formerly Miss Maria Jennings of Riversdale Terrace. She emigrated to Houston to work as a nanny in 1958, and she and her husband were good friends with the astronauts and their wives. What, you might be wondering, were these special items sent from Houston? Well, Mrs. Lillian Jennings prevailed upon the family connection to ask for some autographed photos for her young children, a request that was declined. It seems Houston had a problem with that. Apparently, signed photographs were considered too valuable. But the Jenningses did receive large colour photos of the Apollo 8 takeoff and of the 3 astronauts in training for the mission. There's no sign that the Jennings felt any resentment about this space-age parsimony. And good for them. Someone more inclined to pettiness might have commented on the irony that they could put a man on the moon, but not, well, you get the idea. Back down to earth, but still amid stars of a different kind, one lucky Sunderland woman met some famous faces when she won a visit to Pinewood Studios. An edition of the Echo from September 1966 shows a photo of Lorna Spargo of Tanfield Road with Carry On film stars Kenneth Williams and Peter Butterworth. Lorna, 20 at the time, was chosen as Miss Odeon in a heat of the Queen of Durham competition, sponsored jointly by the Sunderland Echo and Sunderland Corporation. As part of her prize, she visited Pinewood Studios with the runner-up in the heat, Miss Jacqueline Holdsworth of Arnold Road, Farringdon. The film in production as the pair visited was Carry On, Don't Lose Your Head. And Lorna commented that Kenneth Williams was as funny off stage as he is when he really is acting. She also witnessed a volcano being built for an upcoming James Bond film, but expressed disappointment having missed Sean Connery by about 10 minutes. Still shown regularly on TV today, the Carry On films were not lavish productions and the actors in them weren't highly paid. A moment like this, though, absolutely priceless. 1973 was a big year for Sunderland, still talked about in the city today. It was, of course, the year the then town's football team beat Leeds in the Wembley Cup final. 2 fans hit the front page of the Echo in November that year. This was not so much a brush with fame as a tussle with notoriety, as the pair faced a court for having used forged ballot vouchers in an attempt to get tickets for the final. Their bid was thwarted by a sharp-eyed official of the club who, in July of that year, had been at a turnstile distributing tickets in return for vouchers. Noticing something askew, he'd handed the forged vouchers to the police. By their own account, the pair hadn't hoped to profit. They simply wanted to make it to the game. Mr. Esmond Fawkes, who defended the men, noted that they were so unhappy about what had happened that when a further draw landed them with legitimate vouchers, they didn't take up their tickets. In May of 1967, we find this story of 5 young men on what is far more readily identifiable as a winning streak. Thousands of school children were fascinated by the skills and efficiency of the 256 officers and men aboard HMS Phoebe, the Royal Navy general purpose frigate, which has been on a 5-day visit to Sunderland. But 5 boys from Camden Square School, Seaham, showed the sailors a thing or two when it came to rowing, and last night they defeated 2 boats crewed by the sailors in a half-mile race from the aluminium bridge at the docks up to the Phoebe's berth in South Docks. The smooth style of the boys in university boat race fashion saw them pull clear in the last 150 yards along the length of the Phoebe, as sailors leaning over the rails shouted their shipmates on, but in vain. The lads all expressed an intention to go to sea in later life, whether as a merchant seaman or by joining the Royal Navy. Let's hope they were just as successful in these aspirations as they were in the race. 4 young men found themselves in hot water 6 years later in 1973, when they were excluded from Shiny Row Comprehensive School by their headmaster, Mr. Brian F. Gaffney. The reason? Their hair. Long locks were everywhere in 1973, but Mr. Gaffney was a stickler for a school rule, presumably applicable only to boys, which said hair must be of collar length. 14-year-old Ian Elder is the only one of the lads pictured as part of the story, looking rather stylish, you have to admit, and his dad, Mr. James Elder, spoke out in the teenager's defence. What has long hair got to do with education? The headmaster is denying my son the right of education. Ian likes his school, where he has many friends, but we are fed up over the whole business. Ian has already had his hair cut, but apparently not to the headmaster's satisfaction. In my opinion, it's not long. Mr. Gaffney himself said, there must be discipline, and I have got to draw the line somewhere. There's one point of the story that particularly strikes the eye in retrospect. The disgruntled Mr. Elder tells the Echo that he intends protesting to the Minister of Education and Science, one Margaret Thatcher. What her response was, we have not been able to discover. But given her later record, we don't imagine there would have been a great deal of sympathy. But we started this particular jaunt into the past by talking about fame. Fame, as we all know, is fleeting, especially in the long run. Sunderland strongman Samson Besford has gained national fame before the Second World War thanks to a diet of electric light bulbs and allowing lorries to run over his body as he lay on Sunderland town moor. By 1950, the Wearside Echo's column was asking, where is Samson now? It did have an answer, however. The columnist had called in at the strong man's little 2-room home in Henry Street, Hendon, and learned that Samson, real name Joseph, had been knocked down and badly injured by a lorry in 1947. He'd been awarded £850 compensation, the equivalent of about £30,000 today. After the death of his second wife, he was also raising 2 children alone and on the lookout for a third spouse. A reader's letter to the Sunderland Echo in 2013 seems to confirm that Samson never did remarry, despite offers. But 75 years after the Echo asked, where is he now? Samson is still remembered, commemorated by this mural in Athol Road, Hendon. And we remain in Hendon for our final story plucked from the pages of the past. In fact, we remain on Henry Street, with another resident who had lost their spouse. The final resident of the street, in fact. And unlike Samson, she did not seem to be looking to the future at all. An edition of the Echo from November 1963 tells us of a Mrs. Jane Lydia Taylor. When darkness falls, 54-year-old Mrs. Jane Lydia Taylor, the last person living in Henry Street, Hendon, bolts her front door and begins a lonely vigil by a smoky fire in a small back room. A lamp burns on the table. Somewhere in the shadows, a clock ticks ominously. I'm nervous about sleeping here because strange things happen here at night, Mrs. Taylor, who is a widow, told the Echo. Outside there is a wasteland. On both sides of what was once the area's longest street, the shells of buildings stand silent and sinister. Rats dart across the road. Mrs. Taylor has lived in Henry Street for 24 years and remembers when it was a bustling place. She says she would like to spend the rest of her days in Hendon. The trouble is I'm disabled, and although I've been offered a house in Grangetown, I want to be near my friends. They help me in a lot of ways, said Mrs. Taylor. She admits, however, that the dankness of the house is injuring her health. Her furniture is mildewed and a stream flows down the stairs from the derelict upper story of the house in wet weather. Apart from the 2 small rooms she occupies, every window in the building was smashed long ago. Sometimes, as she sits alone at night, she hears prowlers in adjoining buildings. She hides her handbags at dusk, and the doors in the front rooms of the building have been barred so that no stranger can penetrate her sanctuary. On her front door, Mrs. Taylor has chalked a message: "Someone lives here, police informed." It would be nice to have a warm, dry place, but I dread being right out at Town End Farm or Grangetown. "My life has always been down here," Mrs. Taylor said. A welfare officer commented, "It's a sad case." Mrs. Taylor stands at her door and cries in wet weather. And there we must leave her. At 54, Mrs. Taylor was not an old woman by the standards of today. Whether ultimately she got her wish to end her days in Hendon, we cannot say.